Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the haunting story of Rosa of Savannah and a Christmas Eve massacre born from desperation that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The genesis of this story is not found in the quiet ink of a history book, but in the deafening silence that follows a scream. It begins on Christmas Eve, 1857, in the bustling gaslit city of Savannah, Georgia. The very air hummed with celebration. Horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestone streets, carrying families wrapped in wool and velvet. From the grand parlors of colonial homes, the sounds of joyful hymns and the rich scent of pine and roasting turkey spilled into the frosty night. It was a tableau of civilized piety, a carefully constructed portrait of Southern grace, celebrating the birth of a savior and the promise of goodwill toward all men. But travel a few miles out from the city's festive heart, where the streetlights dwindle and the manicured lawns dissolve into the vast, dark maw of cane and cotton fields. Here, under the same indifferent moon, the air told a profoundly different story. At the Riverbend plantation, there were no hymns, only the low, mournful sigh of the wind. And inside the opulent great house, the cloying sweetness of spilled brandy mingled with the newer shopper scent, the metallic tang of fresh blood, pooling and cooling on the Italian marble floors. Before the sun would rise on Christmas morning, the formidable Chamberlain dynasty, an institution of wealth and terror, would be violently and irrevocably extinguished. Four brothers, the proud heirs to a brutal empire, lay slaughtered. They had not been dispatched by a gentleman's duel or a rival's poison. They had been systematically butchered, their bodies rendered almost unrecognizable by an instrument of the most common, domestic labor, a simple firewood axe. The accounts printed in the Savannah Morning News in the days that followed would frame the event in the language of shock and horror, speaking of an incomprehensible savagery, an act of primal, animalistic violence. The courts, in their cold deliberation, would label it madness. But the truth of what transpired on that holy night was a far more terrifying and intricate tapestry than either of those simple words could convey. It was not a sudden, mindless frenzy. It was a reckoning, precise and ceremonial in its execution. This is the story of what occurs when a human soul is pushed so far into the abyss that it learns to see in the dark. It is the story of how an instrument meant to provide warmth can become a vessel of terrible, righteous justice. And it leaves us with a chilling question. What unforgivable crime must first be committed against a person to make the slaughter of four men on Christmas Eve feel not like murder, but like the final, violent balancing of a scale? To comprehend the silence that followed those screams, one must first understand the ground upon which the blood was spilled. One must understand Riverbend. From a distance, the plantation was an artist's vision of Southern prosperity. A grand two-story manor with towering white columns stood as a sentinel over 400 acres of fertile Georgian land, a monument to the power and perceived permanence of the Chamberlain name. But to truly see Riverbend was to look past the facade. It was a kingdom built upon a foundation of pain. A gilded prison where the breathtaking beauty of the landscape served only to mock the profound ugliness it concealed. The estate was a self-contained world. deliberately isolated by a labyrinth of dense pine forests and murky riverways, a geography that ensured its secrets and its people were well kept. It was a sovereign nation of cruelty, where the laws of God and the United States of America felt like distant rumors, replaced by the singular, absolute, and often capricious will of its masters. The very air seemed to hold a different weight here. In the big house, it was thick with the scent of cherry tobacco, expensive French brandy, and beeswaxed floors the aroma of unchallenged power. But a mere 100 yards away, separated by a manicured lawn they were forbidden to walk on, the slave quarters offered a starkly different sensory experience. Here, the air was heavy and stagnant, a foul mixture of old sweat, damp cotton, the low-grade fever of despair. The cabins were little more than wooden boxes, their planks so thin that the winter cold did not just seep in. It sliced through them like a blade. Plantation ledgers from the era, while focused on the cold calculus of profit and loss, inadvertently paint a grim picture through their omissions and marginalia records of blankets requested but never supplied, notations of rations cut to punish a slow harvest, the purchase of iron shackles listed next to the purchase of fine china, while the chamberlains warmed themselves by roaring fires. The singular hearth in the quarters burned just low enough to illuminate the passing rats. Never enough to truly warm the bones of the living. Riverbend was not merely a place of forced labor, it was a meticulously crafted psychological ecosystem of oppression, designed to systematically dismantle the body and, more critically, to annihilate the spirit. This empire of misery was the direct and deliberate legacy of Colonel William Chamberlain, a man who had carved his fortune from the soil with the blood and bone of others. He was known across Georgia not for his honor, but for a terrifying efficiency in converting human beings into entries on a ledger. Upon his death, he bequeathed to his 4 sons more than just land and titles. He left them his cruelty as a birthright. A philosophy of absolute dominion they each embraced and amplified in their own distinct ways. They were the undisputed gods of this small, violent world, and their sadism, whether intellectual, carnal, religious, or impulsive, was the only law of the land. And within this meticulously maintained kingdom of suffering, 2 souls began to move in orbits destined for a catastrophic collision with fate. The first was a woman the Chamberlains knew as Phyllis. To her masters, she was the pinnacle of her training, the perfect house slave, 28 years old, born and raised within the suffocating confines of Riverbend. Her movements as silent and predictable as a solemn grandfather clock in the main hall. She was a ghost in an apron, a shadow trained to serve at the table, to become invisible in the face of casual brutality, and to perfect a smile that betrayed nothing of the inferno raging within. Her silence was so profound, so absolute, that they mistook it for contentment. They never looked closely enough into her eyes, dark, deep, and unnervingly still, to see that they had stopped blinking, as if they were fixed on a point far beyond the plantation walls, focused on a memory, or perhaps a vow. Her stillness was not peace. It was the unnerving, profound calm at the very center of a gathering hurricane. The second soul was a man named Isaiah Carter. He arrived at Riverbend as an anomaly, a man not born to chains, but one who carried the ghost of a different life within him. His mother, the story went, had once been a free woman in a northern state, until a legal betrayal, a signature on a piece of paper, had reclassified her freedom as an illusion and her bloodline as property. That faint memory of liberty seemed to linger in Isaiah's posture. He walked with his shoulders squared, an act of unconscious defiance in a place where men were taught to stoop from boyhood. His eyes were sharp, observant, and not yet broken by the lash of the relentless Georgia sun. There was a presence about him that was a quiet threat in a place like Riverbend. It was the dangerous, lingering scent of hope. He did not preach rebellion or speak of escape, at least not at first. He simply existed, and his very existence was a quiet, powerful refutation of the Chamberlain's world. The inevitable happened where it always did, in the shadows, in the brief, stolen moments where the master's eyes were turned, behind the acrid smoke of the curing house, under the cover of a darkness so complete that only the stars could bear witness. Phyllis and Isaiah found a fragile sanctuary. He spoke to her, his voice a low whisper against the chirping of the crickets, of a place called Ohio, of crisp, clean air, of mornings without a master's bell, of a life where a man's worth wasn't measured in the weight of the cotton he picked. Phyllis, a woman who had learned early that words were traps and promises were poison, did not speak much. She simply listened, but with every whispered story from that other world, with every time his hand accidentally brushed hers in the dark, something buried deep inside her, something she had long ago walled off and left for dead, began to stir. It was a feeling like the frantic wings of a caged bird, a terrifying, unfamiliar flutter. In the suffocating darkness of Riverbend, this forbidden, unspoken connection was the only light. And in a world built and maintained by the Chamberlains, hope was the most dangerous contraband of all. That fragile hope. However, a contraband emotion in the tightly controlled ecosystem of Riverbend did not go unnoticed. Jonathan Chamberlain, the eldest of the four brothers, was a man who prided himself on his intellect. He saw his plantation not as a mere farm, but as a complex social mechanism, and he, its chief engineer. From the bay window of his study, he observed the subtle currents of his domain. He saw the shift in Phyllis's posture, the almost imperceptible lightness in her step. He saw the lingering glances exchanged with the new man, Isaiah, glances that were as loud as a declaration of war in the plantation's enforced silence, but where another master might have seen only insolence deserving of the lash. Jonathan saw something far more valuable, a new lever of control, a psychological vulnerability to be expertly exploited. One evening in late autumn, as the air grew sharp with the coming cold, he summoned Phyllis to the main parlor. The room was his sanctuary of power, filled with the scent of aged leather, cherry tobacco, and the faint, sweet aroma of port. He stood by the roaring fire, a silhouette against the flames, watching her approach. "Phyllis," he began, his voice a calm, silken thread that could soothe or strangle with equal ease. "I have been observing you, and the new man, Isaiah." He let the statement hang in the air, a quiet accusation. Phyllis remained perfectly still, her hands clasped before her face a placid mask she had spent a lifetime perfecting. He gestured to the chair opposite him, a gesture so contrary to their established dynamic that it was in itself a form of disorientation. She did not sit. He smiled, a thin, knowing expression. "Your work has been exemplary. You are a model of obedience." He took a slow sip of his port. "But obedience is a simple thing. Loyalty. However, loyalty is a sentiment that must be earned, even from one's property." He swirled the deep red liquid in his glass. "Tell me, do you wish to be free?" The question, so direct, so impossible, was a calculated detonation in the quiet room. Before she could formulate a response, he continued, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Continue to serve this family with devotion through the Christmas season. Let there be no mistakes, no whispers of discontent. Make this house a beacon of Southern hospitality." He set his glass down on the mantelpiece with a soft, deliberate click. "And when the first flowers of spring appear, I may find myself in a generous mood. I may find myself drafting papers of manumission. He never mentioned Isaiah's name again, but the implication was a masterstroke of psychological cruelty, as clear and as sharp as a shard of glass. Freedom, not just for her, but for them. It was a future so blindingly bright it was impossible to look at directly. He was not offering a gift. He was forging a more effective chain, one made not of cold iron, but of the white-hot fire of hope. That night, in the darkness behind the smokehouse, Phyllis said nothing of this to Isaiah. The dream was too fragile, too sacred to be risked in the open air. Words were traps, tools of the master. Instead, she simply pressed her forehead to his chest, her body trembling with the weight of this impossible secret. For the first time in years, she allowed herself the dangerous luxury of imagination. She saw a small cabin with a yellow door. She heard the sound of laughter that did not need to be stifled. She felt the warmth of a life that was not owned. She allowed herself to believe. That belief was a secret sun inside her for 2 weeks. It made the cold pre-dawn floors seem less biting, the endless hours of servitude less crushing. Then, one morning, the sun was extinguished, and the world plunged into an icy, absolute darkness. Isaiah had vanished. He was not in the fields, not at the stables, not in the quarters. He was simply gone, erased from Riverbend as if he had never existed. The news did not come from a master's pronouncement. It came through the cruel, informal telegraph of the slave quarters, a chain of whispers. A pained look from an older field hand who had overheard the Chamberlain brothers at their dinner table the night before. Samuel, the preacher, had apparently been bragging. Got a fine price for a fine mule. He had slurred, raising his glass of brandy, and the other brothers, including Jonathan, had laughed. The mask of obedience, so carefully maintained, did not crack. It solidified, becoming as hard and as cold as porcelain. The next morning, she saw Jonathan in his study. Her face was still, her voice a low, calm murmur that betrayed nothing of the tectonic plates grinding and shattering beneath the surface. "You spoke of the spring," she whispered, the words barely audible over the scratching of his pen against the ledger. Jonathan looked up, his expression one of mild annoyance at the interruption. He took a moment, feigning recollection. "Ah, yes," he said finally, his tone dismissive. "The field hand, a matter of business. He was not part of our bargain. Phyllis." She held his gaze, searching the depths of his eyes for any flicker of remorse, any sign of shared humanity. She found nothing but the cold, flat reflection of his own power. "And me?" she asked, her voice steady. He offered a small, patronizing smirk. "Spring is still coming, is it not? You have your duties." "Be a good girl." She did not reply. There was nothing left to say. She turned and walked away, her steps quiet, measured, and deliberate. But as she passed through the cavernous kitchen, her hand, as if with a will of its own, reached out and brushed against the cold, heavy spine of a meat cleaver hanging beside the hearth. Her fingers curled around the worn, smooth wood of the handle for just a second. It was not a thought, not yet a plan. It was a sensation, a feeling of weight, of balance, of potential. It was the first tremor, a warning that the pressure building inside her had reached an intolerable level. The foundation of a long-suffering silence had begun to pulverize into dust in the days that followed. She moved through the great house like a phantom, her work more flawless than ever. She served the men who had stolen her future, her face an unreadable slate. The house was filled with their booming laughter, their casual cruelty, their supreme and utter obliviousness to the storm they had so carelessly unleashed. Then came the final, soul-crushing blow. It arrived not like a thunderclap, but like a pestilence on the wind. A story carried by a wagon driver from a neighboring plantation, whispered from one terrified soul to another until it found its way to her ears. Isaiah had tried to run, a desperate, foolish bid for the freedom he had been promised. He had broken free from his chains near a creek, but hadn't gotten far, his escape hampered by a previously injured foot. The overseer at his new plantation was a man whose reputation preceded him, a man who believed that pain was a language everyone understood, and that public terror was the most effective form of instruction. The story, pieced together from horrified, fragmented whispers, was a litany of systematic dehumanization. They had stripped Isaiah down and tied him to a whipping post, not for a simple lashing, but for a lesson. They made a spectacle of his defiance. They took turns breaking him, clinically, methodically, leg by leg, bone by bone, transforming his body into a living testament to the price of hope. By the time he finally died, hours later, there was barely a recognizable human form left. The news found Phyllis as she was polishing the family's silver. No one spoke the words to her directly. They did not need to. The sudden, heavy silence that fell over the room when she entered was its own eulogy. The pity and terror in the other women's eyes told her everything. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not collapse. The others watched in fearful awe as she continued her work, her movements becoming even more precise, more deliberate, her polishing cloth moving in slow, steady circles, as if she were erasing something from the world. In that moment of profound, unnatural calm, something inside her died. The Phyllis who had dared to dream, who had felt the flutter of hope, was gone, executed as surely and as brutally as Isaiah had been. And something else, something far older and colder, was born in her place. She had, in the truest sense, stopped being human, not to them in their eyes. She never was, but to herself. Her grief did not manifest as sorrow. It calcified into a terrifying, diamond-hard purpose. A chilling clarity settled over her. She began to observe not as a servant, but as a hunter. When she washed the Chamberlain brothers' coats, she noted the seams where they kept their pocket watches and their pearl-handled knives. She memorized the distinct weight of each man's footsteps, the unique scent of their pomade and their liquor, the precise, dissonant creak of the second stair outside their bedchambers. She rose earlier and went to bed later, her work ethic becoming a terrifying spectacle of perfection. No one noticed that the firewood was now being chopped with an almost surgical precision, each log split clean in a single blow. No one noticed that the heavy felling axe was being moved, cleaned, and dried with a new, almost reverent care. And no one noticed the most significant change of all her eyes no longer followed the ground in deference. They were always watching, waiting, measuring. The promise of spring had been a lie, but something else had taken its place, a vow, as cold, as hard, and as patient as a winter frost waiting to settle deep beneath the soil. Isaiah was gone, but Phyllis was still here. And the axe, she now understood with absolute certainty, no longer belonged to the firewood. The vow she had made was not forged in the heat of passion, but in the cold, clear understanding of her enemy. To the world, they were the Chamberlain brothers, pillars of Savannah society. But in the private, unwritten ledger of Phyllis's memory, they were four distinct demons, each defined by a unique and unforgivable brand of cruelty. The axe would not fall indiscriminately. Its judgment would be specific, personal, and tailored to the sins of each man. This was not to be a massacre. It was to be a series of meticulously executed sentences. The first name on this spectral docket was Jonathan. At 42, he was the eldest, the intellectual, the architect of the family's sophisticated sadism. He was a man who could quote Shakespeare and the Stoics while coolly commanding a man's breaking, believing that his education gave his brutality the veneer of necessity. His evil was not the explosive rage of a lesser man. It was a cold, calculated logic. He believed in order above all else, a divine and profitable system, with him at its apex and all others nailed beneath. Historical accounts from visitors to the plantation note his refined manners and eloquent speech. Yet slave narratives from the region speak of masters like him as the most dangerous of all. He did not need to raise his voice to inflict pain. His true weapon was the one he had used on Phyllis, the poisoned promise, the sweet, deliberate manipulation of hope. He would offer the illusion of freedom with one hand while signing a death warrant with the other. His was the sin of the mind, the ultimate betrayal that had set the entire tragedy in motion. Next was Paul, 38, the smiling predator. He was a man slippery as oil, his cruelty a quiet, insidious thing. He rarely raised his hand in overt violence, not from any sense of mercy, but because his particular appetites did not require bruises on the outside. Paul's domain was the shadows of the great house, his prey the youngest and most vulnerable of the house girls. He would tell them it was a favor, that it was better to be chosen by him than to be ignored. Phyllis had spent years keeping a careful, calculated distance from Paul, but she had seen the aftermath of his visitations in the kitchen, the girls who returned too quiet, their eyes hollowed out, the blood-stained rags she would later find hidden behind the stove. She remembered a child named Elsie, barely a woman, who had simply vanished from the plantation one winter, claimed to have been sent north for training. No wagon ever came for Elsie. Paul's sin was the sin of the flesh, a silent, creeping pestilence that stole the light from children's eyes. Samuel, at 35, was the preacher, the man of God. He wore a heavy silver cross like a piece of armor and carried a leather-bound Bible like a weapon. Every Sunday, he would read from the good book, his voice resonating with false piety as the slaves stood in the dirt, heads bowed, listening to sermons about obedience and the divine order that had made them chattel. God made us masters, he was fond of saying, to teach the rest their place. But his real scripture was pain, he believed, or claimed to believe. That punishment was a form of purification, that the screams of the whipped were the sounds of the soul shedding its sins. In his study, he kept a different kind of ledger from Jonathan's not of accounts, but of human suffering. It listed names, dates, infractions, and the prescribed number of lashes, all recorded in a neat, tidy script. It was Samuel's hand that had tied Isaiah to the whipping post the night before he was sold. Samuel's voice that had quoted scripture as the leather fell. His sin was the sin of the soul, the ultimate blasphemy of twisting faith into an instrument of torture. And finally, there was Thomas, the youngest at 28, the same age as Phyllis. Thomas did not hide behind philosophy, charm, or religion. He was pure, unadulterated temper, a storm in boots and bourbon. He beat men for coughing too loudly and once fired his pistol at a slave child for crying during his card game, shattering the girl's arm. Unlike his brothers, Thomas did not believe in hierarchy or legacy. He believed only in the visceral, immediate language of fear. He was a creature of impulse, his violence as unpredictable and as destructive as a lightning strike. He was the raw, unleashed ID of the Chamberlain dynasty, the brutal force that underpinned his brother's more refined cruelties. His sin was the sin of the fist, the loud, chaotic violence that ensured the quiet, systematic violence of the others could continue unchallenged. 4 brothers, 4 demons, 4 debts that were now due. The night of the reckoning began not with a prayer, but with a remembrance. After Isaiah's death, Phyllis had never prayed again. The last time she had closed her eyes and whispered to the sky. His body was still warm in her arms. Since then, her lips had learned to stay shut, not because she had stopped believing, but because she had come to understand that prayers had not saved anyone she had ever loved. What she did now, in the final hours of December 24th, was something different. It was a recitation, a sacred litany spoken not to heaven, but to the deepest, coldest parts of herself. She sat on a low stool in the back pantry, the great house behind her pulsing with the drunken laughter and boisterous carols of the men who believed themselves immortal. The wine had worked its magic. The fire in the main hearth was burning low. Outside, the wind moved like a restless spirit across the cane fields. She closed her eyes and began the list. Elsie, Isaiah, Mama, Binta, Moses, Hector, Grace. One name for each step she would take through that house. One name for each swing of the blade. Each name was a weight, a stone in her heart. Each was a drumbeat, steady and resolute. She was not alone in this. They were all with her now, an army of ghosts at her back. She rose slowly, the kitchen clock ticking with agonizing slowness toward midnight. The other slaves were either asleep in the quarters or curled in the dark corners of the house, too exhausted and too afraid to lift their heads. No one questioned her movements anymore. She had become so perfectly, flawlessly predictable. She moved through the servant halls with steady, silent steps, her soft shoes making no sound on the floorboards. Every candle she passed seemed to flicker, its flame bowing as if in recognition. Outside, in the biting cold, she reached into the hidden gap she had prepared days earlier behind the fish barrels near the smokehouse. Her hands found the cloth bundle. She unwrapped it. The axe head gleamed in the moonlight, not polished, but honed to a terrifying, razor sharpness. It was the kind of edge that only time, fury, and purpose could grind. She tested its weight, her arms steady, strong from years of labor. They did not tremble. They remembered their task, just as the axe did. Back inside, she moved with the intimate knowledge of a predator in its own territory. The Chamberlain brothers were scattered, just as she had anticipated. Jonathan had retreated to his office to gloat over his ledgers. Paul had followed a terrified young house girl upstairs. Samuel had passed out in a wing-back chair near the fireplace, his wine glass still clutched in his hand. And Thomas, restless and agitated, was wandering the halls, his pistol swinging lazily from his belt. They were isolated. They were vulnerable. She inhaled deeply. The air smelled of cinnamon, cedar, and wood smoke. But in her mind, she imagined it was the smoke of a different kind of fire, the kind that once lit the way for runaways in the swamp, the kind that signaled war. She stepped into the main hallway. The floor creaked once, a familiar sound, and then held. She tightened her grip on the handle. From this point forward, there would be no turning back, no Macy, no last words. There was only the axe and the names: Grace, Thomas, Isaiah, Samuel, Elsie, Paul, Mama, Jonathan. She did not say them aloud. They pulsed in her blood. Outside, the final bell of the town church began its slow, solemn toll for midnight. Inside, no one knew it would also toll for the end of a dynasty. The office smelled of pipe smoke, old leather, and the dry, dusty scent of ink on paper, the scent of decisions made in quiet rooms that resulted in screams elsewhere. Jonathan sat alone, just as she knew he would, his boots propped on a stool, a half-empty glass of brandy resting on the desk beside the plantation accounts. The oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows across his face, softening the cruel lines that arrogance had carved into it over the years. Phyllis stood in the doorway, a shadow within a shadow, holding the axe low, still wrapped in a kitchen cloth. She did not hesitate. She had already committed this act 1,000 times in her mind, rehearsed it until it no longer felt like a beginning, but like a conclusion. She stepped into the room. He heard her now, glancing up from his papers, his eyes sluggish and unfocused from the drink. "Phyllis," he asked, his voice dry. "Something wrong with the fire?" She said nothing. She just stared. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, a faint annoyance at this breach of protocol. He began to rise from his chair, a question forming on his lips. That is when she moved. One quick, fluid stride, both hands gripping the axe handle, bringing it up and over in a single, perfect arc. The blade came down. The sound was not loud. It was a dull, wet thud, like a heavy log splitting in the rain. The body convulsed once, then slumped back into the chair. The brandy glass tipped from the desk and shattered on the floor. A river of dark red blood poured across the open ledger, mingling with the ink, erasing the names and numbers of his profits. She did not look away. She stepped back, watched his chest for a moment. There was no movement, no breath, no more lies. She calmly reached over and turned down the lamp's wick, plunging the room into near darkness before closing the door gently behind her, as if leaving a man to his sleep. One. She moved through this hall again, her breath steady, her steps soft. The axe was warm now. She passed the parlor where Samuel still slept, his mouth agape, the Bible crumpled in his lap. Not yet. She needed him to see. Upstairs. She heard a soft whimper from behind Paul's door. That would be next. But first, the girl. She climbed the grand staircase, each board groaning with a familiar ache. At the top, she paused. The hallway stretched before her, a corridor of ghosts. She reached Paul's door, gripped the axe, and knocked. The knock was gentle, almost polite. There was a shuffle from within, then footsteps. The door cracked open. Paul's face appeared, his shirt half-buttoned, his eyes glinting with a mixture of suspicion and smug pleasure. "Phyllis," he slurred, "what is it you need?" She did not speak. She simply swung. The axe met the base of his neck with a sickening crunch. He screamed, a high, strangled sound, staggering backward. She followed him into the room, relentless. The second swing caught him in the chest. The third shattered the ribs beneath. He tried to crawl toward the fireplace poker, his mouth gurgling nonsense. She stepped on his hand, leaned down, and looked him directly in the eyes. "Her name," she said. Her voice, a low, steady whisper, was Elsie. The final blow silenced him forever. In the corner, the young girl trembled under a blanket. Phyllis lowered the axe, her own breathing hard now. She knelt. "Go to the cookhouse," she said softly. "Stay with Auntie May. Do not open the door for anyone." The girl stared, then scrambled out of the room. 2. As she stepped back into the hall, the axe dripping, she saw Samuel stumbling out of the parlor, blinking in the dim light. He saw the blood on the floor, the trail leading from his brother's door. He saw her. He saw the axe. "Phyllis," he stammered, the Bible falling from his hand. "What? What have you done?" She said nothing. He backed away, his face a mask of horror. "It's Christmas," he pleaded. "You cannot do this on his day." She stopped, looked him dead in the eye. "His day came and went," she said. "This one is mine." He turned to run, slipped on the polished wood at the top of the stairs, and tumbled down, landing in a heap at the bottom. He lay groaning, quoting scripture through a mouthful of blood. She followed him down, one step at a time. her movements as calm and inexorable as a rising tide. She raised the axe and ended the sermon. 3. Only Thomas remained, and as if summoned by the thought, a door slammed open at the far end of the house. A roar of rage, not of fear, echoed through the halls. Thomas had found a body. He was awake now. He was armed, and he was hunting. Good. Let him come. Phyllis gripped the axe, its weight now a familiar comfort. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. The roar that echoed through the blood-chilled halls of the great house was not a sound of grief or horror, but of pure, primal rage. It was the sound of a predator wounded, cornered, and reverting to its most basic instinct destruction. Thomas, the youngest, the human storm of the Chamberlain family, was now fully unleashed. He did not think in terms of strategy or justice. He thought in terms of obliteration. He moved through the house, not like a man hunting a killer, but like a force of nature seeking to annihilate the source of its pain. He kicked open doors with splintering force, overturned tables laden with the remains of the Christmas feast. His shouts a litany of curses and threats that shattered the sepulchral silence. For Phyllis, this was the final test, the final seal on her vow. The other brothers, creatures of logic, lust, and dogma, had been dispatched with a chilling, calculated precision. But Thomas was different. He was chaos incarnate. She did not hide. She did not run. To do so would be to revert to the role of prey, a role she had shed forever. Instead, she stood her ground in the grand foyer, at the bottom of the main staircase where the portraits of Chamberlain ancestors looked down with cold, painted eyes. She was an island of stillness in a sea of her own making, the bodies of his brothers lying in the shadows around her. She held the axe not in a posture of aggression, but with a quiet, waiting solemnity. Let him come. Let the final, ugliest piece of this dynasty shatter itself against her resolve. He found her there, alone, blood-spattered figure illuminated by the moonlight slanting through the tall windows. For a single, stretched moment, he froze, his drunken mind struggling to process the impossible tableau. He saw the quiet house slave, the human furniture he had never truly looked at twice, now standing as the epicenter of his family's extinction. And in her hands, he saw the tool of their demise, held with a natural, familiar grace that was more terrifying than any sword. He didn't waste breath on words. He simply lunged, the pistol already in his hand. The shot exploded in the confined space, the sound deafening, the muzzle flash a brief, violent star that illuminated the horror on his face. The bullet tore a chunk of plaster from the wall, just inches from her head. He had lived his entire life believing in the power of fear, the ultimate authority of the gun. But in that moment, his greatest weapon was utterly useless. It was a tool of intimidation against a woman who had already lost everything there was to fear. Before his finger could tighten on the trigger again, she moved. She was faster than his grief, faster than his rage, faster than his drunken reflexes. She closed the distance between them, and the final confrontation was not one of modern weapons, but of something far more ancient. It was a brutal, desperate, and primal struggle. His raw, explosive power against a focused, unyielding purpose. The fight was short, chaotic, and absolute. When it was over, Thomas Chamberlain, the final son, lay still at the foot of the staircase he had so arrogantly climbed his entire life. The last of the 4 demons was silenced. A profound, unearthly silence descended upon the house. A silence so deep it felt like a physical presence. The storm had passed. The dynasty was dead. For several long minutes, Phyllis did not move. She stood amidst the carnage, her chest heaving not from exertion, but from the shuddering release of a weight she had carried for a lifetime. The axe, finally, fell heavy in her hands. The great house, which for so long had been a symbol of absolute power and impenetrable authority, had been fundamentally and irrevocably transformed. It was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb, consecrated by the blood of its tyrannical kings. On Christmas morning, 1857, the sun rose over a new and terrible reality at Riverbend. The first screams did not come from the slave quarters they had learned long ago to muffle their grief. The screams came from the chamberlain wives, who awoke not to the sounds of celebration, but to a silence so complete it was a scream in itself. The discovery of the 4 bodies sent a shockwave of horror through the county. And then the state. The collapse was total. The carefully constructed facade of Southern grace and aristocratic order had been ripped away in a single night, revealing the rot, depravity, and violence that had always festered just beneath the surface. The Riverbend plantation, as it had been known, ceased to exist in that moment. It was no longer a name synonymous with wealth and influence, but a byword for a horror so profound it felt biblical. The institution had been decapitated, its brutal reign brought to a close not by an army or a political decree, but by the quiet, methodical, and righteous work of a single woman who had decided that enough was enough. What became of Phyllis is where the solid ground of history fractures into the murky waters of legend. The official record, penned by the authorities whose entire worldview she had threatened, is simple, brutal, and serves as a tool of control. It states that she was found, perhaps in the quarters, perhaps near the river, her bloody work completed. She was captured, bound in chains, and put on trial, in a legal system where her testimony was inadmissible, a system designed to protect the very men she had killed. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. The newspapers of the time, such as the Savannah Morning News, devote pages to the savagery of the crime, but only a few lines to the perpetrator, referring to her trial as a swift and necessary formality. Her demeanor was described as either insane or demonic, her motives incomprehensible to the civilized mind. She was sentenced to death and publicly hanged. Her body made a gruesome example, a warning intended to extinguish any embers of rebellion that might glow in the hearts of others. This is the story that written history chose to preserve a neat, tidy conclusion designed to restore a semblance of order and reinforce the power structure she had so violently dismantled. But there is another history, an unwritten one, that was never carved onto a tombstone or printed in a newspaper. It was a history whispered in the slave quarters at night. A story passed from one generation to the next, a legend that grew with each telling. This history tells a different story. In this version, Phyllis was never caught. After her work was done, as the first pale light of Christmas morning touched the horizon, she simply walked away from the house of horrors. She cleansed the axe in the cold, clear water of a nearby creek and vanished into the labyrinthine depths of the great dismal swamp. She became a ghost, a myth, a figure of both terror and reverence. They called her the Axe of Christmas, a spirit of vengeance who haunted the backwoods, a protector of the runaway, a nightmare to the cruel master. Did she help guide others to freedom along the Underground Railroad? Did she live out her days in one of the hidden maroon communities deep within the swamp? Or did she become something more, a symbol, an idea? This is the lingering secret of Riverbend. The official records provide a body and a rope. The whispers provide a legacy. Her story became a sacred, cautionary tale, a reminder that the monolithic system of slavery, for all its iron chains and legal fortifications, was always vulnerable. It was vulnerable to the unbreakable power of a human soul that had been pushed past the edge of despair and into the realm of pure, cold resolve. And so, we are left at the end, standing in the ruins of a fallen dynasty, holding a story that defies simple judgment. Was the event of Christmas Eve, 1857, a savage crime? Or was it an inevitable act of war when a system of law is designed not to provide justice, but to sanctify and protect the crimes of the powerful? Does an individual who rises up against it become a criminal, or a soldier in a war that has been waged against them since birth? The story of Phyllis forces us to confront the uncomfortable, bloody, and complex nature of justice itself. It suggests that when all avenues for redress are systematically and violently closed, when hope is wielded as a weapon of manipulation, and when one's very humanity is denied, justice may not arrive in a courtroom wearing a black robe. It may arrive in the dead of night, on the holiest of days, wearing a servant's apron and carrying an axe. The axe is, perhaps, the most powerful symbol in this entire American tragedy. For years, it was an instrument of her servitude, a tool used to chop the wood that warmed the men who owned her, who abused her, who stole her love and shattered her future. It was a symbol of her oppression. But in her hands, on that one night, it was reforged in the crucible of her grief. It became an extension of her will, an instrument of liberation, a terrible, articulate voice for the voiceless. It was the physical manifestation of a justice that was as brutal, as personal, and as absolute as the cruelty it sought to answer. Her story is an enduring and terrifying warning. It is a testament to the fact that no system of oppression, no matter how powerful or entrenched, is ever truly stable. It proves that within the quietest, most subjugated soul, there can lie a capacity for judgment and retribution that is as powerful and as unstoppable as any force of nature. It is a stark reminder that you can own a person's body, you can command their labor, and you can legislate their silence, but you can never, ever own their memory. And sometimes, as the ghosts of Riverbend can attest, memory alone is a weapon sharp enough to bring an empire to its knees.